I do not think it's a surprise that President Putin has shifted focus. The progress in the Donbass has been a bit slower of late, but 50,000 soldiers have massed against what's believed to be about 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And you can only imagine the orders that were given by President Putin to his generals: get these Ukrainians out of Russia. I don't care how you do it, get them out of Russia. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing this big push, huge casualties, but I don't think Russia cares.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Sean is a former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast. Sean, welcome.
Hey, good day to you. I'm not quite sure what time it is with you, but out here in Kyiv, it's about a lunchtime on a beautiful sunny day.
Well, I did want to start with that. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin announced that he's open to some sort of agreement or the idea of a ceasefire. You've been in Kyiv for the last week and in Ukraine. Does it feel like Russia is preparing to halt their attacks there?
No, I have to say, talking to a number of people out here in Ukraine, clearly I'm not talking for the whole population. I can't possibly speak for the whole population. But there's a sense of incredulity here, first of all, about how come the Americans have gone from being their best ally for 3 years to suddenly being their enemy and dancing closely with the Russians. But secondly, working out, okay, what don't you understand? That Putin will never stop this war. A ceasefire to what end? How would it, on earth would it be actually policed and the like? And besides, fundamentally, Ukraine says that whilst they're prepared to talk, they're not prepared to concede their sovereignty. And they have been fighting this war for 300 years, not since 2022. And they are pretty clear that there is no future where Russia sees Ukraine as an independent sovereign nation. And therefore, how can you negotiate? And I think that what's pretty clear is the headline terms of what Russia said, despite the fact they've been nodding their heads saying, yes, of course, we're open to some peace. Their terms were Ukraine can't join NATO, no NATO troops on their border, and Ukraine can't rearm and re-equip. That's not the DNA of a sovereign nation. So at the moment, Ukrainians are just a bit incredulous, sort of wondering where on earth this is going. They want an end to the war. They just can't quite see how President Trump's going about it.
Well, on that, the Times is reporting this morning that Steve Witkoff, who has been acting as a sort of envoy to Moscow, might have been dismissed by the Kremlin or sent packing in a way. Is Zelensky right? I mean, I think you probably, by the sounds of things, agree with this, but is Zelensky right when he says Putin wants to continue this war?
Well, I think the danger is in the media, we get sort of transfixed by the day-to-day details and by, American going out to speak to Putin, to have a conversation. The trouble is the foundations are what I look at. And let's talk bluntly, ceasefires only work if both sides have sort of got themselves in a bit of a stalemate and see benefit in bringing the war to an end. Or one side has won and the other side has lost, in which case it's agreeing the terms of the surrender. Neither of those two situations exist at the moment. The only person who wants this war to end now is President Trump. And he's put pressure to bear on Ukraine, on President Zelensky, to agree to at least a 30-day ceasefire. But of course, how on earth do you encourage President Putin to do so? Now, Putin will not want to upset President Trump so early in his presidency, but he's been pretty clear, I think, that Russia is on the front foot. It is winning bluntly in the war. It is ejecting the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region and is making progress by pushing Ukraine forces back on the front line. So in that context, why would President Putin stop? And therefore, all of these theatrics around visits and potential negotiations, the only person who must be chuckling away is President Putin himself, who must have thought all his birthdays had come at once, having initially tried to take Ukraine and failed, been involved in a long and bloody conflict where the West was gradually stepping up and making life more and more difficult. Suddenly, the main player in the West, the US, has suddenly changed the view entirely. And suddenly, I think President Putin sees a green light to go ahead and achieve his full objectives.
And how closely should we continue watching the battlefield developments at this point? Obviously, there's Kursk, which we'll come on to, but overnight there were continued drone attacks by both sides. Ukraine hitting more oil refineries, Russia striking across northern Ukraine with drones. Is there, should we look at that as whether or not Russia or Ukraine, for that matter, are really willing to bring a halt to the fighting?
Well, it's a great question because it's almost impossible to tell at the moment. I think what Ukraine is trying to do is create the most stubborn resistance and to make the price of success in Ukraine so expensive for Russia that they will have to stop. Most military analysts believe that President Putin does not really want to do another round of mobilization because that might erode his support base at home. After all, there's huge casualties. He can control the media, he can control the messaging going out to Russia. But when brothers, sons, daughters do not come back from the front line and there are funerals, gradually the distrust starts to build. And therefore, there is a view, Russia's lost a lot of tanks, a lot of military equipment, and is struggling to sustain the level of its fighting. Yes, it's used North Korean troops. They seem to have suffered an immense number of casualties as well. And therefore, it might well suit Russia to have some form of pause at some stage. And by pause, I don't mean a 30-day catch your breath. I'm talking about 5 years where they can rearm, build more tanks, build more weapons, look at very closely how they fought the war, where the West was strong and where the West was weak, and therefore plan on how to start again in 5 years' time. So there is a benefit for some sort of pause in this war. I think Ukraine is just making life as difficult as possible for Russia so that it can't break through. And I think the one thing I would say with a sense of relief, particularly on the Ukrainian side, is that when America decided to stop the flow of weapons into Ukraine, that created a sense of panic because although on financial terms, Europe provides about as much as the America. When you look at actual bombs, bullets, and missiles, America provides far more than Europe does. That could have been catastrophic in the longer term. The good news was that Ukraine does hold stocks of weapons. The last time that the flow of American weapons was stopped in 2023, it was stopped for several months, but there were enough stockpiles to keep it going. The one really dangerous thing for Ukraine was when America said, we're going to stop intelligence sharing, because literally that was like a light switch. It was turned off in a heartbeat. And that made life incredibly difficult for Ukraine. So I suspect at the moment, Ukraine is just about holding its own. It is slowly retreating, but it's trying to make life as painful as possible. Meanwhile, the question then remains, what is Europe going to do about it? And what is President Trump's plan B?
Well, I certainly want to come on to that, but just one more on that ceasefire idea. I mean, we've heard the Russians and Putin himself being quite critical of this idea of a 30-day ceasefire. He essentially says there's nuances to it, but he also seemed to imply that there's no mechanism or kind of policing method to hold an immediate ceasefire. But should we read into that? Is he right there? I mean, I think most people would imagine it, if the leader of the military says stop fighting, you can issue that order and troops will stop.
I know in an idealistic world, you're absolutely right, but we're talking about over 1,000 kilometers of front line, and exactly where that front line is, who owns what and where, it is actually quite difficult to know. And it's not like established trench lines. This is door-to-door fighting, and you can imagine just how trigger happy anybody would be on the front line. And, without an established... Now, one of the ways of doing it is everybody withdraws 500 meters to create a 1 kilometer buffer zone. But if you're Ukrainian and you've been fighting for every inch of your territory, are you really going to walk away 500 meters and expect that Russia will do the same and expect to be able to return to your starting positions at the end of the 30? Of course you're not. You're going to be deeply, deeply skeptical of that. How are you going to police any, gunfire or whatever? If a ceasefire was genuinely, as it's meant to be, it's a precursor to the end to the conflict, then in a way, all the soldiers are a sense of relief because they go, thank goodness, we don't want to be the last person to die in this war. We want to prepare ourselves for the peace. Thank God it's over. That is not what's being put on the table at the moment. Nobody, I think, from the Ukrainian side, nobody from the Russian side believes that any ceasefire is going to lead to a peace. And therefore, all it means is both sides are going to be rearming. Both sides are going to be looking to restart with an advantage, jump across the start line slightly early, which might not sound very, sportsmanlike. This is not a sport, it's war. And therefore, I think it's very, very difficult practically to police a 30-day ceasefire if there's no realistic prospect of that lasting peace following on from that process.
And a big part of that Putin also raised in his announcements yesterday was, of course, Kursk. It appears that Ukraine have now lost Sudza, that town in Kursk, taken by Ukraine in that lightning offensive back in over the summer. Is it likely Ukraine will now have to withdraw? Could they relaunch their offensive? Is it maybe beneficial that they do withdraw from Russia if they do want some sort of ceasefire?
I think what's fascinating here is when you look back to last year when they moved into Russia, there were many of us, I have to say, myself included, who were somewhat sceptical about what they were actually trying to achieve, because it's quite difficult to sustain operations within Russia. They were clearly diverting limited resources, in other words, taking resources away from the very active front line. President Zelensky made clear that he had no intention of holding the territory, but it was clearly a distraction to try to force Russia, give them some embarrassment, undermine President Putin's position. But Putin largely just said, okay, if you want to have some troops up there, I will just continue pushing in the Donbass. You've eroded your position. I think what's changed now is that with the prospect of President Trump trying to have a conversation, you imagine now that you are the Russian president. You are not going to want to enter those negotiations with Ukrainian soldiers on any Russian territory. That is a bargaining chip that you're not going to tolerate. And I do not think it's a surprise that President Putin has shifted focus. The progress in the Donbass has been a bit slower of late, but 50,000 soldiers have massed against what's believed to be about 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And you can only imagine the orders that were given by President Putin to his generals: get these Ukrainians out of Russia. I don't care how you do it, get them out of Russia. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing this big push, huge casualties, but I don't think Russia cares. They just want to make sure that they take that potential option off the negotiating table for Ukraine. So the real question then is, does Ukraine hold out to the last man, or do they go, we never intended to hold this. Let's withdraw gracefully, preserve our combat power, and potentially then go back to bolster the front lines down in the Donbass. I mean, that's a tactic we don't really know. But again, watching President Putin turn up allegedly into the Kursk region in his beautifully new fatigues that have never seen the light of day. Putin's never served in the military, so it was all a little bit odd. And he was looking every day of his 70 plus years, I have to say, out of a suit and out of the hallowed halls in Moscow. But I do think this is all part of get the Ukrainians out. And for Ukraine, it's how do you preserve combat power and not allow that to have a critically damage your fighting capability.
And the loss of Sudza in Kursk came in the middle of the US suspension of arms and intelligence sharing with Kyiv. Keith Kellogg was on Fox News last week. He kind of dampened down the idea that it could have had a huge impact, saying, oh, well, a few days of weapon suspension won't change the tide of the war. But is he right? I mean, there's been some significant shifts in that time, hasn't there?
There have. I think it's always a bit dangerous to jump to conclusions here. My own view is that whilst the stopping weapons flowing potentially was very serious, as I've alluded to, I think the Ukrainians normally carry several months' worth of supplies in spare. What they would have had to do is to create a plan to be more careful with the use of munitions. But it wasn't like going down the shops, there aren't any anymore. Oh dear, we're stuck. I think far more seriously, far more worrying was that intelligence, because that was turned off in a heartbeat. And everything that helps Ukraine It's all about getting inside the mind of your enemy. If you can listen to the Russian communications, you can work out what they're going to do next. If you use satellite imagery to watch what the Russian movements are, you can warn the Ukrainians. You can provide accurate target details so that they can fire their precision weapons and have decisive effect. As soon as you turn all that off, Ukrainian forces are blind. They're worse, but more poorly informed than their Russian counterparts. And I think that makes any offensive action very difficult. And also, you can't anticipate where the Russians are going to attack you. And therefore, I think that was far more dangerous than the lack of weapons. How much effect that had on the battlefield, I think history books will be written about that. But I think that's the one that would worry me most.
And the US has sort of claimed that that pause in support forced Kyiv into these negotiations. But does Trump now have the ability to force Putin to the table as well? I mean, the administration today says they've toughened sanctions on Russian oil, gas, and banking. Is that likely to have any effect?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to look into these extra sanctions. I believe actually there's part of this was a window in the post-Biden era where some of the sanctions were paused, and that extension hasn't that lapse has not been extended. So I'm not sure this is a significant ramp up of sanctions. I have to say, unfortunately, I'm a grey-haired warhorse of a different era. I've never been a believer that sanctions are going to be critically enabling. First of all, Russian economy relies on oil and gas, a lot of it. Whilst the West may not be buying much of it, Russia is still selling the same amount of oil and gas. It's just selling it through a different means now. And it's still making a lot of money. The world still needs oil and gas. Russia is still providing oil and gas. So, yes, are we ratcheting up pressure? Is it uncomfortable for Putin? Is his economy suffering with inflation? All of those answers, yes. But I remember a year ago, some of the briefings I was being given was that the Russian economy within a year will be on its knees. Well, we're a year later, and those same briefings are now saying within a year, the Russian economy will be on its knees. So I'm very skeptical that that is an effective lever. I think the real question for me is, I think President Trump has been very clear. He wants to bring the war to an end and stop the killing. He has forced, encouraged, depending on your adjective of choice, President Zelensky to come to the table. But so far, all he's used is carrots, not sticks, with President Putin. And this might be a very clever ruse to flush out President Putin's real objectives. In other words, if he does want an off-ramp, and let's face it, it's been a very difficult war for Russia. If he does want an off-ramp, President Trump is clearly trying to give him that option, taking NATO membership off the table, talking in language which President Putin might understand. The real question, though, is if President Putin doesn't take the bait and actually just goes, yeah, but, which is what we're seeing at the moment, and carries on. I think that's the moment where President Trump potentially looks a little humiliated. And the question then is, what are his options to actually bring this war to an end? And I think that's where the conversation gets very interesting.
And what perhaps are some of those sticks that Trump could use to encourage Putin to come to the table? I mean, have we heard any sign of what he might be willing to do outside of sanctions?
We haven't heard anything, but I do think what's fascinating is on the international stage. I mean, let's be really clear. As an old warrior, if we have in the West, we have an order of magnitude more military capability than Russia. If to date, we've largely given Ukraine enough support to keep them in the game, but we've not given them enough support to stop Russia in its tracks. And we could do that. Yes, there are risks with doing that, but frankly, there are risks in not doing it as well. And President Putin knows full well that if the West was to get involved, he would be stopped. And that's why he's been so threatening. That's why the West has largely kowtowed away from him. But, and it's a big but, if Europe, who largely took their security under the NATO umbrella, suddenly go, is America going to be quite as reliable as a partner anymore? And second is that we therefore it might be more dangerous for Europe. And we've just given away a lot of our weapons. We've taken our stockpiles that were already relatively limited down to even more dangerous levels. We've now got a double whammy. We've got to try and increase our weapon stocks, make our defense more robust. But also, if Ukraine was to fall, that has profound implications for European security. All of a sudden now, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've started seeing Sir Keir Starmer talk about potential for boots on the ground, potential for things like no-fly zones. And there's a lot of discussion. Sky Shield is another one of those that's recently done the round of how do you create a more credible deterrence for against Russia, because it's pretty clear they're not going to stop this through a negotiated settlement, and any negotiation won't probably be the worth its paper it's written on, because it won't guarantee the security of Ukraine. And I think that's a really difficult conversation, but the West, particularly Europe, seems to be up for it.
And as we've said earlier, you're in Kyiv, Ukraine's capital at the moment. What has the reaction been there among Ukrainians to this change in the US administration and Trump's drive for what he calls a kind of quick peace?
I think there's an element of shock. Ukraine knows full well that they could not have survived without Western support, and they're very grateful for that. There's no question about that. I mean, there's a really interesting question. I think any country in the world, apart from maybe America and China, would not be able to withstand the onslaught. They would need help from allies, and of course, allies have helped Ukraine. What they suddenly do is, why this sudden change about face? How can the president of America suddenly ignore Ukraine? But I do sense, when I was here in October last, I sensed still an element of resilience, an element of determination to still prevail. I remember literally 2 years ago, I was berated regularly by a Ukrainian friend who said, "Why are you so downbeat? You know, these things happen. We will kick Russia out. You know, they'll go out with a bloody nose, and that will be the end of the war." Now that feeling is very different in Ukraine. There's a weariness. There's a sense that this has got to come to an end. This is 3 years. The price has been huge. The impact on our families, our culture, our prosperity, our future. And I think that is profound. I think it's also interesting, though, that President Zelensky's future has been questioned, and about elections and the like. When I was here in October, I couldn't find anybody who had a good word to say about President Zelensky. And I was quite surprised, because I thought on the world stage, he's been outstanding. I have to say, this visit, everybody I've spoken to has been very supportive of President Zelensky. They don't necessarily agree with all his policies, but when your leader is absolutely humiliated in the White House the way that President Zelensky was, that has galvanized the nation behind him. So there is no doubt in my mind that he enjoys unrivaled support now. They want to see him through. Whether he long-term stays, if you look at his face, I've not met the man, but it's etched. The trials and tribulations of this war are etched all over his face. But there's no doubt at the moment out there in the streets of Kyiv. Now, one thing I should add is that Kyiv is a microcosm. It's a beautiful city. My mother was worried about me coming out here because she could imagine it was like the London in the Blitz. It isn't. You struggle to find any buildings damaged if you walk around the city. Of course, there are some, but they're not. It's not obvious. The one thing that is obvious is there's not fighting age men wandering the streets. The bars and everything are closed around 10. And Maidan Square, where all of the flags are fluttering, where there's a flag place for every life lost from the city, tens of thousands of flags. And I went down there and spent another hour just sat there in the sunshine, and I find it incredibly humbling. I find it very moving as a military guy, because it's very palpable. Whilst the city bustle carries on, it's a very tangible example of just what price that they're paying here for this, for their freedom.
And I wonder if you could tell us a bit of some of the work you've been involved in while you've been in Kyiv.
Yeah, there's been three main themes, I think. One of them is Superhumans is one of the charities. In short, I spent 2 years in Afghanistan, and I watched a lot of our young men and women, largely men, lose arms and legs. And it's one thing repairing them physically, then you've got to get them used to prosthetics. And then thirdly, how you get their mental frame right. Ukraine is suffering an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude more suffering. And last time I was out, I raised £10,000, took it out to Lviv, and it was a very moving visit there. This time I'm only coming to Kyiv, but I regularly support a team that brings veterans from Lviv to Kyiv for the weekend, takes them to a football match, buys them a beer, gives them a pizza, basically just part of their rehabilitation. And I was able to meet up with some of them, which again was very humbling. Can I change the dial? and solve the problem for them? No, I can't. But can I do a little bit to help the morale of a few of the people? Absolutely right. I think that was true. Second one is that the ghost of Kyiv, who was a famous fighter pilot, Juice, he lost his life a couple of years ago. His mother lives in Kyiv, and it's always a privilege to meet her, Lilia, because my mum used to worry about me flying. I worry about my son who's in the military, and of course she worried about her son. And it's fascinating seeing the work she's doing, trying to inspire the next generation of people. And the third thing I do out here is for the last 3 years, I'm not a journalist. I'm a former military guy. I'm a talking head for the Ministry of Defence. There's a danger when you don't come to a war zone. I don't want to go to the front line, but you get a very different flavour of what's going on when you come and visit. And I've done a series of media interviews for Ukraine television. They're always fascinated about why is the West doing this? Why is Trump? And you can be a bit of a bridge into that. So I find it very heartwarming. And everybody I've met is just so incredibly grateful, both to the West, both to our country for the support they provide, but also just on an individual level, that people are prepared to come to a war zone, spend a bit of money, listen to them, and put a physical and metaphorical hug around them. It's invaluable.
Well, Sean Bell, thank you very much for sharing that experience with us and coming on Frontline today to speak with us.
Lovely. Always a pleasure, Louis.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.